Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for logging on. I just want to welcome you all for being here. And let me begin just by thanking everyone for joining us today to explore the top questions that we've heard in the public about nuclear power. My name is Doug Opseth. I'm the Director of Generation Asset Management and Planning at SaskPower, and I'm honored to be your host and moderator today. At SaskPower, our work reaches the ancestral lands of many nations. As a Crown utility, we reaffirm our relationship with the peoples of these lands and our shared determination to preserve these lands for generations to come. Today, I'm joining you from Regina in Treaty 4 territory in the homeland of the Métis. Saskatchewan's power system is changing, and we're inviting our customers to learn more about the supply options we already use and some we're considering for the future. We're currently in the process of updating our long-term supply plan, and we know that this plan must deliver cost-effective, reliable power that meets greenhouse gas emission targets. But how do we get there? That's what our future planning engagement process is all about. It's a 5-stage process, and we're looking for input at each stage. During the first stage of our engagement process, participants told us that they wanted to learn more about the supply options we currently use and what's being considered for the future. They also wanted to hear from other jurisdictions and industry experts. So we're here today hosting our first ever energy education series that we're calling Power Talks. We are privileged to be joined here today by 5 wonderful panelists who have joined us for our conversation. I will introduce them shortly. What I'm going to do today is ask our panelists some of the top questions we hear about nuclear power. We will also pull some questions from our panelists, and we'll also leave some time at the end for additional questions. A couple of process questions as we get going. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a black banner that includes a chat button. Please use the chat button only if you're experiencing technical issues and one of our team members will do their best to assist you. You'll also see a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. That's where we invite you to add your questions for our panelists. These questions will only be seen by our hosts and panelists until we mark them as answered. Finally, we're recording today's event so we can post it online for those who couldn't attend today. All right, let's meet our panelists. First off, we have Gary Rose. Gary has worked for Ontario Power Generation, or OPG, for 35 years. Gary is currently the Vice President of New Nuclear Growth at OPG. In his capacity, he's responsible for the development of opportunities to deploy new nuclear in Ontario while working with other jurisdictions in Canada and internationally to develop opportunities for nuclear expansion. Welcome, Gary. Next up, we have Chief Emily Weta. Emily sits on the Anishinaabe Nation Leadership Council and is the Vice Chair of the Indigenous Advisory Council for Small Modular Reactor Action Plan. She's also a panel member of the Electrification Energy Transition Panel in Ontario. Emily serves as Chief of Curve Lake from 2019 to 2022. She's passionate about the rights of First Nations people, ensuring her community has every opportunity to thrive, protecting the environment for all generations, the protection of treaty rights, finding ways to ensure economic advancements occur in a sustainable manner, and to building healthy relationships between First Nations and Canadians. Thank you for being here today, Emily. Next, we have Paul Thompson. Paul is the Senior Strategic Advisor for Advanced Reactor Development at New Brunswick Power. He's spent over 43 years in the nuclear industry, power industry. He's a member of the steering committee that developed the Pan-Canadian Small Modular Reactor, or SMR Roadmap, the CEO SMR Forum Working Group, and the CANDU Owners Group SMR Technology Forum. Glad you could join us today, Paul. Next, we have Sarah Deaton. Sarah is the Director of the Advanced Reactor Licensing Division at Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, or the CNSC. She's been at the CNSC since 2009. Sarah and her team are currently responsible for licensing small modular reactors and advanced reactors. This division is also the SMR readiness hub for the organization, ensuring a coordinated approach to organizational readiness for regulating small modular reactors as well as new advanced technologies. Welcome, Sarah. And last but not least, we have George Christides. George is the Vice President of Government Relations and International Affairs of the Canadian Nuclear Association, or CNA. He is also the Director of Federal Affairs for OPG. With over 20 years of experience working with federal, provincial, municipal, and international government stakeholders, his experience includes diverse public and private sector involvement. Good to have you here today, George. We appreciate all of you joining us today and supporting this conversation in Saskatchewan. So now I'd like to go into a few of the questions. I will work through some panelist questions, and then we'll open the floor to the questions from the public. The first question I'm going to turn over to you here, George. As we've heard in your bio, you've been with the Canadian Nuclear Association for quite some time in government relations with respect to energy and the environment. Many utilities, just like Saskatchewan, are facing significant transformations in order to reach net zero. Can utilities across Canada reach net zero alone?
I'm sorry, I had to mute there.
Oh,
So I'm sorry, the question, could you repeat
yeah.
that? You sort of cut out for
Sure.
a moment.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Many utilities, just like Saskatchewan, are facing significant transformations in order to reach net zero. Can utilities across Canada reach net zero alone?
No, utilities, have an opportunity here to take a look at their regional realities, right? To take a look at what those different regions need in terms of different technologies to achieve their goals. So the utilities working together actually increases the opportunity to meet those net zero goals. And our colleagues, here today, like Gary and Paul and others that could speak to that. But that's partly why that there's sort of this pan-Canadian approach, for example, around this small modular reactor initiative, because I think the utilities have the opportunity to work closely together and achieve those goals and maximize that impact.
Yeah, well, that's great. And building on that a little bit is, why do you think we are seeing this resurgence in Canada and elsewhere exploring nuclear power? And what are you hearing from other countries around the world with regards to nuclear power?
Yeah, it's very interesting. Obviously with the increased emphasis on addressing the climate crisis, as the reports coming out of the UN and IPCC report address that, there really is a climate crisis that's emerged and emerging, along with the sort of the geopolitical tensions and the war in Ukraine has really increased the need for clean energy technologies. And of course, nuclear is part of that. Both the small modular reactors, but also the larger reactors are now being discussed in external markets and international markets, and even domestically more so. And it's really driving the discussion to how nuclear could be part or on the menu of clean energy technologies to address those crises, as it were. So that's really kind of the drivers. And I think, again, our colleagues like Gary and others could speak more, deeply on those matters as utilities are looking to achieve net zero goals and the role that SMRs and other technologies can play collectively, is a wonderful opportunity to address those challenges.
Yeah, so it sounds like it's not just Saskatchewan, Canada looking at this. It sounds like a lot of countries around the world are really taking a look at this as well.
Absolutely. It's fair to say that Canada has been a leader in this space as it's developed options, particularly around the small modular reactor piece for sure. And Canada being one of the key countries that's seeking to address those climate objectives, particularly, it's absolutely an international and domestic trend in terms of looking at these technologies.
Oh, excellent. Well, thanks, George. Maybe turning a little bit over to the cost, the question of cost and the balance between nuclear and renewables. Paul, maybe I'll turn this question over to you. Given that nuclear is currently perceived as being a more expensive option when compared to other generation options, I guess the question we sometimes hear is, why pursue it? Why not just go with more renewables? And then the second part of that question might be can we reach net zero with renewables alone?
Well, thank you, Doug. So I'd like to address this perception with two main points. So the first one I'm going to start with relates to the fact that nuclear has a high upfront capital cost, but that is then paid back over the lifetime of the station. So that upfront cost is what people sort of stick in their minds, and the main factor from affecting that cost is the interest accumulated during construction. And this is where SMRs have a number of very important benefits here. They have a lower overnight cost compared to large nuclear, since their overall cost is less, and they have fewer systems and components. SMRs also have shorter construction timelines and thus lower interest costs because they are modular in nature, and thus more construction is done offsite and in parallel. And thanks to some recent developments within the federal government, we now have access to lower interest loans or cheaper capital as well, which really helps. And these SMRs get their economy of scale through the application of a fleet approach, which is what we're trying to develop. And I think the strategy that SaskPower is following to de-risk their project following the deployment of the Darlington New Nuclear Project by OPG is a very logical and smart move. The other point I wanted to make is with regards to some other important factors that need to be considered in the energy selection strategy. First thing, nuclear footprint is small compared to other forms of clean energy. And the nuclear provides significant socioeconomic spin-offs and thus puts a lot of money back into the local and provincial economy. And very importantly is nuclear provides base load energy, which is 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. And therefore many people look at just the base cost for alternatives and do not include effectively the total cost that has to be provided to ensure that the utility can meet the total demand on the grid. And so all of these factors need to be considered in the energy selection choice. And I want to make sure that that's not seen as being nuclear is trying to put down the other forms. We need a healthy mix of all clean energy types in order to be successful. It's just that I think there is a perception out there, and it needs to be looked into in more detail in order to arrive at the balanced opinion that nuclear does make economic sense.
So it isn't really a case of renewables versus nuclear power. It's how do they work together? And maybe building on that a little bit, can you get to net zero with one technology alone? Can you get there with renewables alone, or can you get there with any one technology by itself?
Yeah. No, you can't get there with renewables alone, and one would want a healthy mix of clean energy types. And certainly in Saskatchewan, you have a lot of sunshine, you have a lot of wind. And so, the proportion, if you wish, of renewables can be higher than in other areas of the country. And then that makes sense for a really balanced portfolio of generation types. And that I know is the strategy that SaskPower is certainly exploring, and we should kudos to SaskPower for this kind of strategy development.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, thanks for that, Paul. I always love hearing from New Brunswick. I think there's a lot of kinship and a lot of similarities between Saskatchewan and New Brunswick. So it's always great hearing from the perspective from New Brunswick. So, Gary, maybe I'll turn a question over to you here and hear a little bit about what your experience. I know that OPG is looking to significantly expand generation capacity to deal with electrification, energy growth. In fact, 2 recent reports from Ontario's Independent Electricity Operator highlight the demand for electricity in Ontario to exceed current forecasts. This increasing rise in demand, coupled with the impact of nuclear facility retirements and potential refurbishments and expiring generation contracts over the next 10 years, is contributing to anticipated energy shortfalls in the mid-2020s. I'm wondering how you see nuclear fitting in amongst all your other supply options you're considering.
Sure, thanks, Doug. You're right. The Ontario's Independent Electricity System Operator issued what they call their Pathways to Decarbonization report in December. And their assessment, in order to achieve net zero by 2050, you need to more than double the electricity grid in Ontario. And that's consistent with the earlier conversation you had with George. We're seeing this all over the world. Jurisdictions looking at their current energy usage, the need to electrify and decarbonize transportation, residential heating, or industry. Most jurisdictions are looking at 2 to 3 times the amount of energy needed to achieve net zero by 2050. So in Ontario, our perspective is to meet this anticipated demand, you need a diverse supply of low emission energy sources, not just nuclear, as the conversation you and Paul just had. You need to be looking at renewables, hydrogen, et cetera, as part of this mix. We need to mobilize every non-emitting power source and mitigation, including hydro, renewables, nuclear, clean fuels like hydrogen, and use of carbon capture and storage where required. But in Ontario right now, nuclear makes up 60% of the electricity consumed each and every day, provides affordable, reliable energy 24/7, and avoids about 45 million tons of CO2 emissions each year. So getting back to that Pathways to Decarbonization report, the doubling is from 42,000 megawatts to 88,000 megawatts. And for nuclear, we have currently 13,000 megawatts of capacity. The report is predicting the need for an additional 18,000. So again, more than doubling our nuclear fleet in the next 25 years. That's in addition to the refurbishments that we have underway at Darlington and our Bruce Power nuclear plants to allow those to operate for 30 or more years. It will include potentially the refurbishment of our Pickering plant, the Darlington new nuclear project that we've commenced, but obviously much more nuclear than that in order to meet those demands of 18,000 megawatts. Again, nuclear has been our backbone of Ontario's electricity system at that 60% level, and we expect that to continue for years to come as we meet this total energy needs. We can't achieve it through hydro. To the extent that we can expand hydro, we will. To the extent that we can expand renewables and other sources, we will. But we need more nuclear to achieve this goal.
Yeah. Oh, interesting. That's a great perspective for Ontario. And I'm looking through some of the questions we're getting from the audience here. And one of the questions that I see, and maybe I'll give this to Gary, and maybe then I'll kick it over to George for answers. Is there a role? We're talking about the cost of energy transition. Do you see there a role there for the federal government helping with helping fund this energy transition? Maybe Gary, if you want to start that, then maybe George, we can go over to you to get your thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. So we are, there is a huge amount of projects needed. In Ontario, we're just talking about doubling of the energy system. Nuclear alone, 13,000 megawatts to 18,000, adding an additional 18,000. That's building out our entire fleet of nuclear and then some. So where the government can help, and the government has actually really stepped up in the latest budget to provide investment tax credits, to provide research funding for new innovative technologies that we're looking at deploying specifically in SMR space. There's some new technologies that we will need to decarbonize industry in that, manufacturing tax credits. But beyond just the tax credits, we'll need help to ensure that this is an acceptable part of the way we meet our energy demand. So we all need to go through an impact assessment process. How can we make that process more efficient without cutting corners? We need community engagement, Indigenous engagement. We need to do the environmental assessments, but how can we make that more efficient? How do we build up the manufacturing, the supply chain capacity? How do we build up the human capacity, transition workers from coal, gas, and other traditional energy sources to help meet this energy demand that's coming from nuclear or others? So yeah, the federal government has a big role to play, and we're very proud that they're stepping up and starting to be much more active than we've seen them in the space over the last many years.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that, Gary. And George, do you have anything to add on that? I mean, you're quite involved with at different levels of government. Do you have any thoughts on how what role the federal government plays in helping to make this energy transition, I guess, affordable for everybody?
Yeah, I think just like Gary said, there's been a significant increase the last budget in terms of the amount of support and the type of support that the federal government is bringing to the table. And it complements very nicely the excellent work that's being done in New Brunswick and Saskatchewan, Ontario, in terms of provincial levels as well, in terms of what they've been doing. So in some way, the federal provincial cooperation in enabling the opportunities for these technologies to proceed to reduce emissions and engender sort of clean energy to be made available to resource sector, is very key. The federal government has a big role to play, and as Gary pointed out, there has been some pretty significant programs and tax measures identified to support that. The other thing along that, maybe just to put on the table, is the Canada Infrastructure Bank, which clearly now enables investment in nuclear technologies, and there was some initial investment through the Innovation Science Economic Development technologies that I believe Moltex based in New Brunswick as well that participated in. So there's an ecosystem of programs and support, but really fundamentally the thing about the federal budget, if I may, is it really broke the policy ceiling, where nuclear is now clearly embedded in the climate economic policy framework of the government, and programs and initiatives sort of flow from there. And that was quite significant.
Yeah, so it sounds like there's just starting to see a bigger role at the federal level and the role nuclear power is going to play in the energy transition for Canada. We'll stick on the question of cost here for one more. Maybe Paul, maybe I'll ask you this question, and then I'll kick it over to Gary. The question we get asked a lot is, how much will an SMR cost? And can you speak to a little bit about, will it be cost competitive with other supply options in the future? Maybe Paul, if you want to tackle that one, and then maybe we can flip it over to Gary after that.
Yeah, well, I think it really depends on the specifics of the reactor type and whether it's the first in the series or it's further down. But these are being developed with the intent that they are of the order of let's say $1.5 billion to construct. And so, but each one is a little different, and but that it's that order for a grid size reactor, certainly for the advanced generation 4 types.
And do you see that being cost competitive then when you look at the other non-emitting kind of base load energy supplies out there? In your view, do you see that as being a cost effective or cost competitive option?
Yes, when all the factors are considered in, recognizing that it is base load electricity and all the other factors all in, it is an important element. And so yes, we do see this certainly in the area of New Brunswick for sure.
Yeah, maybe Gary, you want to build on that to give me your perspective on that?
Yeah, I mean, so the other base load options you referred to, what are the other base load options? New hydro. New hydro is very expensive. We've sure 100 years ago when we built hydro, it was a lot cheaper than it is today, and we obviously went after the rivers with the most flow and the most opportunity. So you're left with there are opportunities in Ontario for more hydro, and we will look to those. I'm not certain that renewables are an alternative option to baseload, even if they are cheaper, because you need to build generation capacity for when the sun's not shining or the wind's not blowing. So when we look at that, and if many jurisdictions internationally, Germany is one that certainly comes to mind right off the bat, have spent billions and billions of dollars in wind and renewables and have to back it up with the gas, and their carbon intensities increased as a result when they shut down nuclear, as compared to France, which is over 70% nuclear. Their costs are much lower and their carbon intensity is much lower due to the shift. So renewables are great. In fact, nuclear will enable more renewables. If you increase the base load, you can actually have more renewables online when the sun is shining and the wind is blowing. So, we need to look at the entire energy solution when we look at this. And to the point about $1.5 billion, in fact, in some cases, first of a kind projects, that actually may be low. But when you look at the fact that you're going to deploy a 300 megawatt nuclear plant that's going to operate 24/7, probably 320 days of the year, there's going to be maintenance and outage time. So there is, it's about a 93 to 95% capacity factor for 60 to 80 years at a fuel cost that is very low compared to the other alternatives. As you said earlier, big upfront investment. When you look at it over time, and the fact that you're not producing carbon, its costs are very competitive to other options, and you don't have the climate consequential impact in this choice.
Excellent. Well, thanks a lot for that. And I'm going to build off something that Paul mentioned. So maybe Gary, I'll stick this question back to you, and then maybe I'll turn it over to Paul. And then I think after that, I think we'll move. We can stay talking about this for quite a while, but I think we'll move on to safety after that. But one of the things that Paul mentioned was about, the spin-off benefits of an SMR, about the socioeconomic, the benefits that go to jurisdictions as they make that transition to nuclear. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, and then, maybe Paul will get you to build on that comment or question.
I mean, there's a wide spectrum of how I can answer this question. Obviously, the spin-off benefits for nuclear are jobs. That's one that we all relate to. I mean, nuclear requires people to construct its plants. It requires people to operate it. So it's very good for the local economies. Many of these nuclear plants are, think about our plants in Ontario, they're 90+% Canada-based. So the huge impact, positive impact on the GDP of Canada. These are well-paying union jobs. education, research, etc. Supply chain. There's spin-off jobs that come from not just the plant itself, but the industries that are there required. But when you start then extend, well, what are the other spin-offs? In Ontario, when we closed our coal plants, we went from 50-ish smog days a year down to 0. And that is an improvement on the clean air and people's health. The fact that nuclear is used to create medical isotopes for cancer testing and diagnosis and things like that. So there are a number of other spin-offs, like from the medical's perspective, that often get forgotten about in this conversation.
So, Paul, do you want to speak to that? I know, in New Brunswick, the economic impact of having something like a nuclear power plant built there.
Yeah, it is really quite sizable, even recognizing that a lot of the supply chain itself is in Ontario. It is still substantial here in New Brunswick. And so we've got the same thing. You've got the direct employment of people, and then all the indirects that come off of that. You've got the elements of the supply chain as well. One of the interesting things for a region like New Brunswick is that it really did allow for a bit of diversification of the economy. It is a high-tech sector. So not only are there well-paying jobs, but they are high-tech jobs as well. And so it was important in the overall economic development of the province by getting industries such as nuclear power that can start to branch off from what used to be, predominantly forestry and fishing in New Brunswick. So it was an economic diversity. Also, having a nuclear plant here really did bring a spotlight onto the province. We have a lot of groups that continue to come out and look at LaPro, which is the reactor in the background, as it is the flagship of the CANDU 6 fleet. And so it really does put NB Power or New Brunswick on the map. And then that has economic spin-offs as well. So it really is quite significant. And I would think that there'd be a fair degree of parallel type of spin-offs in Saskatchewan as well.
Excellent. Well, thanks, Paul, and thanks, Gary. I think we've got lots more questions, but maybe we'll save some of those questions for the end. I think maybe we'll move on to another question or topic we get asked quite a bit about, and that's about safety. So maybe Sarah, maybe I'll turn a question over to you here. And in your role as Canada's nuclear regulator with the CNSC, you likely hear concerns from the public at the prospect of adding more nuclear in Canada to meet net zero targets and to fight climate change. One of the concerns we hear is the potential for a major nuclear incident to occur, like what happened in Chernobyl or Fukushima. And I'm wondering if you can tell us about what safeguards are in place to prevent a major nuclear incident from happening in Canada.
Thanks very much, Doug. So I think the important part to remember about nuclear power in Canada is that we have a strong, robust regulator in the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, and a license is required for any nuclear power plant. So no one wants to imagine another nuclear incident, but it's our responsibility to plan for every possibility, no matter how unlikely. So while our regulatory requirements and our oversight regimes or oversight activities are focused on preventing incidents and accidents, being prepared in the event of emergency is a key and essential part about being a responsible nuclear regulator. Safety has and always will be our top priority. So there are safeguards in place for preventing accidents such as Chernobyl and Fukushima. And the designs of Canadian nuclear power plants, including the designs for future small modular reactors, must include features that prevent accidents and mitigate impact should an accident occur. And this is supported by our long history in Canada of our operating experience where our nuclear power plants have operated safely. The one benefit about being a nuclear regulator is we have a lot of friends around the world who can help us. And so our membership and international activities ensure that our regulatory approaches are consistent with those internationally agreed upon best principles and practices. So following Fukushima, the International Atomic Energy Association, which is the largest sort of organization for nuclear activities, did a detailed review of the lessons learned. and then directed member states, and Canada's a member state, to make changes. And so as a result of Fukushima, we updated our regulations, our regulatory documents, and our standards to ensure that those lessons learned were applied. We also participate in regular peer reviews from our International Atomic Agency colleagues who come and do inspections to ensure that our operations are operating safely and securely, to ensure that our regulatory fundamentals are in place and that we are implementing our best practices. We also do a number of emergency exercises, including scenarios that would be very much improbable, to help us build that knowledge experience, that operational experience, to ensure that we are ready to respond to any nuclear accident or incident. We have a comprehensive emergency preparedness program in place, and we require our licensees, so those who hold a license, to have robust emergency preparedness programs in place. And so those will deal with emergency preparedness from accidents, incidents, but also from natural disasters. And so what we see with a changing climate is we see an increased occurrence of these natural disasters. So we're looking to ensure that our nuclear power plant operators are prepared to deal with all of these natural disasters that could occur, to ensure that those operations remain in a safe state during a time of stress. Another important part to talk about when you talk about accidents and incidents is the importance of risk communication. And so it's so important the way we talk about risk, both as the regulator, as proponents as yourself, like SaskPower, and then the nuclear industry as a whole, to ensure that the public, Indigenous communities and nations and stakeholders understand the risks from activities, understand what risks are possible, what risks are probable, and those that are highly improbable, and also trying to communicate about risk in a way that people can understand the nuclear sector today. And so there are a lot of good insights on our website, which I'll put in the chat here shortly, which sort of talk about some ways where we can share that information.
So well, it sounds like there's a lot of collaboration and learning that gets shared between the regulators and industry in Canada or around the world. Well, thanks for that. Chief Emily, maybe I'll turn a question over to you. There are a lot of communities in Saskatchewan that are thinking about what does it mean to have a nuclear facility in their area. And I'm curious to hear how your community members reacted when nuclear was first proposed for your area, and what concerns did they have at the time, and had those concerns or thoughts on that changed over time?
Absolutely. Thanks, Doug. I think the first starting place is that we have a number of CANDU reactors operating in our territory. And those were brought in well before Indigenous rights were recognized, before there was conversations with Indigenous communities. And so, we have some awareness of it, but a lot of frustration from being left out of those early conversations and having our voices heard. And so as Ontario Power Generation started looking at this new small reactor that they want to build in our territory, we have the opportunity to rewrite history, to really roll up our sleeves and be a part of those conversations. And OPG has been really, really open and welcoming to us. We were included in the early conversations about which technology, not necessarily in a decision-making capacity, but in understanding the technical requirements that went into that. And going through that process with Ontario Power Generation helped me really understand the safety that's inherent and built into nuclear in Canada. Community for Curve Lake First Nation still has a lot of learning to do. Still sort of stuck on the question of why can't we do this with just renewables? And I think a big part of that has to do with the actual impact and energy consequences of using renewables and really understanding that. In our cultural beliefs, every energy process has a consequence. And so we need to look at those realistically and what are they? Where are renewables built and what does that mean for the environment? So that we can get to the point of understanding that nuclear in its entire life cycle is really minimal in its carbon emissions if they exist at all. Life cycle wise, it's mostly shipping costs. So there's a lot of room in our community to start having conversations about nuclear energy. Those conversations are really starting with, interestingly enough, medical isotopes, the medical opportunities that exist, and the ability to have better access to things that treat cancer really effectively. Honestly, most community members know someone, have a loved one who's had to deal with all of those things. And so starting with the conversations about medical isotopes leaves room to dig into why do we need it? What does it mean for stable baseload? Why is it important? And then you get to a point, you know, in a roundabout way to talk about the safety. Having toured Ontario Power Generation's facilities, there's so many built-in fail-safes to make sure that if there's a tsunami in Lake Ontario, we're going to be okay. And I feel like if there's a tsunami in Lake Ontario, we've got much bigger concerns at that point than anything else. So, you know, I think from a community perspective, it's about really looking at energy impacts, energy consequences, and energy benefits. So, a lot of feeling of you know, it's not a big risk to our community. It's not a big risk to the environment. And if you get involved in those early stage conversations, the things that you are concerned about, you can get answers to or can be accommodated in the actual construction of the facility.
Yeah, well, so it sounds like early discussions and engagement is really beneficial in projects like this in communities. And do you see progress being made in that front in jurisdictions looking at nuclear power in Canada?
Sorry, do I see those progress?
Do you see progress coming? Do you see it? I think it hasn't always been done well in the past, but are you seeing some progress in the front in terms of engaging with Indigenous communities on this front?
Oh, I'm seeing huge progress. Absolutely. When I was chief, there were two relationships that were in a really good place for the community. One was Trent University and the other was Ontario Power Generation. And it wasn't necessarily that way when I was elected, but we worked really diligently to build that relationship, to be able to have open and honest conversations, to be really transparent with information on both sides. And so it was really about relationship building, understanding community concerns and needs and getting information to community, and understanding Ontario Power Generation's needs and wants and getting to those conversations that are meaningful.
Oh, excellent. Well, thank you for that. It's great to bring that perspective to the discussion here. And then, Gary, maybe building on some discussion about security and safety. You know, one of the other questions we get asked quite frequently is around, I guess, security of facilities like this. And, you know, we hear worries about by adding nuclear to our energy supply mix, Saskatchewan could become the target for threats and threat actors. Can you speak a little bit to this risk and, you know, how real is the threat and what are you, OPG, and other nuclear industry companies doing to protect against it?
Yeah, thanks, Doug. I might start off, you know, Sarah talked about the role that the CNSC plays in setting the requirements for us as operators of nuclear power plants, and you know, we integrate with the requirements and look to exceed or do better than the requirements. You know, safety is core to almost everything we do here at OPG. And you know, the industry's approach to nuclear safety is called defense in depth, meaning there are layers of defenses protecting our employees, critical infrastructure, and the public. And when you look at the CANDU fleet that we have here in Ontario and New Brunswick, it's been operating for, you know, 5 decades, and there are systems in our plant that have never been used. Thankfully, those are the systems that give us the backup systems to the main systems that give us that defense in depth that we have to test and make sure that they're deployable in case there is an act or threat, as you say. But you know, we don't expect these events, but we plan for them all the same and practice for them all the same to make sure that we are able to recover or mitigate in these types of threats. You know, also when it comes to the design of the reactors that we're deploying here, the BWRX, for example, the reactor we're deploying at Darlington, the one that you're referring to in Saskatchewan, it's in the midst of going through a design review as part of the license to construct application with the CNSC, and a further review will be required prior to loading fuel and operating the reactor. So the core of that review is to ensure that the design has sufficient defense in depth and safeguards in place to deal with any threats or events that could occur. The reactor will utilize security by design principles, creating engineered barriers against malevolent acts, a tough time saying that. The protected area will include detection and assessment and access control devices that meet or exceed the requirements outlined by the CNSC. So although we don't expect these threats or acts to occur, we, in our design reviews, we need to plan and make sure they're in. They will be tested by the regulator. We'll deploy those and make sure that we know how to operate and deal with those events and deal with those defense mechanisms throughout the life of the asset. So it's something we do plan in and something we build out to make sure that we have the safeguards in place.
Excellent. Well, thanks a lot for that, Gary. Chief Emily, I'm going to turn back to you for another question here. And, we know that drinking water, environmental protection is a huge priority for communities. And, has Curve Lake experienced any negative impacts from nuclear operations in the area?
No. It's a really
simple answer.
easy answer, Doug. We have not.
Yeah.
And like this was one of my big questions when I started learning about nuclear, and going and seeing the facility added a whole lot of clarity, and even looking at the diagrams and the little operational diagrams that OPG can share on how the process works makes it very, very clear that there's no interaction between sort of nuclear impacted water, radioactive water, if you will, and the other water systems. They're very separate and very carefully separated, and the drainage systems are separated. And so other than water temperature through the heating process, there's been no impact on the water, and the heating in the water is something that's really a manageable problem. If Curve Lake's concerned about water temperatures and the impact on fish spawning, OPG is looking at ways to mitigate that, supporting and measuring those temperatures to make sure that there's no impact or minimal impact. And so in terms of drinking water, the issue is certainly not contamination from a nuclear power plant, which is fantastic news. It's far more, far more around environmental impact, and that's, we don't have concerns about that in Curve Lake.
It sounds like there's a lot of monitoring and things that go into place to make sure to kind of monitor and document all that stuff and share that information with people.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that was a part of our learning curve. And now we're feeling fairly satisfied that it's not something that has to be consistent and ongoing. We know that it's there. We check on it now and then, and we feel really comfortable having had access to that information and the support.
Oh, excellent. Paul, I'm going to turn a question back to you. This comes out of something I heard you speak about previously. I know with any nuclear power, there's a lot of ongoing monitoring that's going on. And what I heard you speak about previously was about some changes you made to some of the things you monitor and test for around your facility to deal with some of the things that you found were important to Indigenous groups in the area. Could you maybe speak about how Bruce Power works with the communities to monitor in a transparent way, and how you work with some of those Indigenous communities around your facility?
Yeah, sure, Doug. So originally the monitoring program was set up based on the ecological risk review and all the supporting work around the environment, understanding what could potentially be released from emissions from the nuclear plant, and then established a comprehensive monitoring program, both on-site and off-site, to then validate that those releases were within what was expected from the normal emissions and reported on. And as that progressed, it was important to involve Indigenous peoples in what is important from their perspective, which may not be what the sort of Western science says. These are the endangered, these are the valued eco components, and da. And so they've identified what's important to them, and so we've added those activities into our monitoring program, and also involve them in the collection of samples and in the monitoring program themselves. And what we find, of course, is that the more people are involved, and Emily alluded to this earlier, that the more people are involved in understanding what the programs are and actually hands-on as well and see it, then it really has a significant impact. And in particular, when people, both Indigenous as well as in the local communities, have that sort of hands-on understanding, they are the best people that go back to their communities and talk about it. And that is far more impactful than the utility, saying what we do, what the results are, and so it is coming from someone that the community values, trusts, and understand. And so those are it's been a really successful, and we want to continue to build on that process.
Oh, excellent. Well, it's great to hear about that. One of the questions I've heard, and maybe you can speak to this, was around, tailings ponds and ponds around the facility. Are there tailing ponds at nuclear reactors that you have to monitor?
No, there's not a tailing pond, not a tailing pond at all.
Yeah.
We have a sewage treatment. That would be the only thing that would be, the type of thing that we are associated with, and that, of course, is again carefully regulated and controlled.
Yeah, excellent. Well, thanks a lot for that, Paul and Emily. Sarah, a lot of this is what we were speaking about, monitoring and things like that, and maybe from a regulator's perspective, can you talk about some of the measures that exist to ensure the protection of human health and the environment? And how does CNSC actively engage with host communities to ensure that this information is shared with them?
Absolutely. So I think, as Gary and Paul have discussed, and Emily as well, the importance of the licensee, the license holder, to have an adequate environmental monitoring program that demonstrates that the fish are safe to eat, that the water is safe to drink, that you can do those traditional activities in the area is such an important part of our nuclear facilities, many of which are located across the country in various locations. And so we have a responsibility. We require that our licensed applicants, have very robust environmental monitoring programs, so they provide that information on a regular basis in a publicly available way. And then we also sort of augment that with our own independent environmental monitoring program. And it's a program we're really proud of, where we take samples adjacent to nuclear facilities, so not within the fence line, quote unquote, but outside the fence line, where we take samples of fish and berries and other traditional activities, other traditional items that people may want to consume, to demonstrate that it is safe to do those activities around those facilities. And that's really important to be able to build some trust in the regulatory system we have. So when we say that a facility is safe and that there are no impacts to the environment and the public and health and safety of people, we can point back to that information. Sorry, just 1 second. Violet, yeah, thank you. Sorry, even in a webinar, we always have a child who shows up from home at the end of the day. So
I've been there. I've had that too.
Violet joined every meeting, for any of us who have been there, so my apologies for that. But it's just so important that we can show that information. And so on our website, we have an interactive dashboard where you can look at nuclear facilities in Canada, including the uranium mines in northern Saskatchewan, and see what those sample results are. So it's a really important part, and we try to share that information with local Indigenous nations and communities, with host communities. We try to engage some of them in helping collect some of the samples, or identifying where to collect those samples. And it's a way that we can share the results of our work, to include them in the work, which I think really goes to speaking to the trust in both the regulator and then also trust in the data that we see license holders provide.
Yeah, excellent. Well, thanks for that. And I think that we'll be able to share a link, I think, to where folks in Saskatchewan can see some of that information. Maybe, Sarah, I'm going to keep you for one more second. You heard a few people mention, changes to federal regulations or the approval process to help get nuclear power plants, built in a timely way. It's a lengthy regulatory. Are there things being done to help facilitate getting nuclear power plants or projects like that through the regulatory process in a little more timely way, or what changes can be made there? And then maybe I'll ask you that, Sarah, question, and then maybe George will turn that over to you, and maybe to one of our other panels as well.
Perfect, thanks. So the role of the nuclear safety regulator is to ensure that any licensed facility is operating safely. And so
Yep.
our top priority is safety. But we recognize that in this period of climate change and given the scenario that we have across the country and across the world, that we have a responsibility to be efficient and effective in how we do that regulation. And so we have an SMR readiness project, which is a fancy name for us looking at how we can gain efficiencies in our own regulatory systems, while also working closely with our partners at the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada to see if there's ways that we can work together to be able to still have robust regulatory oversight, detailed environmental reviews, while also acknowledging that some projects want to move forward at a quicker rate. So it's something that we work on internally in looking at how we can be able to find those efficiencies, to be able to work with our host communities to ensure that they have an awareness and understanding of the regulatory process, to ensure that any efficiencies gained don't have a negative impact on the ultimate stakeholders.
Oh yeah. Well, I imagine with the magnitude, when you start to hear about all the potential nuclear projects go ahead, I imagine there's a need for, for the role of CNSC to start ramping up the size of CNSC and the number of people you have there to deal with all the projects coming down the pipeline.
Absolutely. We received over $50 million from the federal government in the last budget to be able to increase the number of staff we have, the regulatory research that we can do to support some of these new innovative technologies that Paul was speaking about that New Brunswick and others are considering. So there really is an opportunity for us to renew and grow the organization to help support the number of activities that are going on.
Yeah, George, maybe I know you have a big role in working with at different levels of government. Are you hearing some progress maybe, or maybe you start with some of the things you would like to see done to help facilitate this move to get some of these projects built a little more, to make it more efficient to get through that regulatory process? And maybe are you seeing some progress at different levels of government?
There's definitely, from a federal perspective, as Sarah pointed out, there's been a significant investment by the federal government. So it's definitely recognized in terms of getting the capacity of the regulator ready to go to manage these new projects. I think that's very key and a very, very positive step. I think, as Sarah pointed out, there's been increased discussions and acknowledgement to some extent that the regulatory regimes need to be efficient and effective just because of the number of projects that will be coming down the pipe. And, again, just to talk a little more globally, it's not only a Canadian, opportunity, but it's also an international one. The challenge of bringing a significant amount of clean energy technologies is recognized. So I know that, President Velchi's had discussions, the IAEA that Sarah could speak about, and other discussions. So it provides a bit of a global context as well as a domestic. But absolutely, there's a lot of good work that's been initiated. And certainly from an industry perspective, I'll defer to Paul and Gary and others that could provide a little more detail. But certainly the importance of being effective and efficient and recognizing that there's a need for an accelerated process of some sort to get these projects going while maintaining, of course, the integrity of the system.
Maybe Gary, I'll turn this over to you, and then Paul, maybe after that we'll move over to talk about spent fuel and waste and stuff like. So Gary, from your perspective, 2035. When I look at 2035, it's not that far off in the future, and you look at the process of getting nuclear power plants built and things like that. How do we ensure that we have these kind of power supply, like these new non-emitting supply options available for 2035 when it seems to be just around the corner?
You're right. I mean, one of the reasons why we're able to move so fast at Darlington is that we already had a licensed site. So it really gives us the opportunity to go forward with the SMRs there. We, as already been said by Sarah and by George, we need to look for ways to do things not on a site by site or a unit by unit basis, but in whole. So, what I'd like to see happen is that there are some features. If we have a standard design for an SMR that is deployed in Ontario and Saskatchewan and elsewhere in Canada, there's some components of that are already accepted or have a lighter review. Of course, each site is going to have site-specific items that we need to do, and community and engagement, Indigenous engagement that will have to be done. But where we can find common ways of sharing data across sites, I think that is certainly an opportunity we need to go after. A lot of these have environmental and community assessments, but also have overall socioeconomical considerations, which can be common in an area. So if we look at Southern Ontario and decide that we want to put nuclear at 3 different sites in Southern Ontario, there's some commonality there that we can approach this a little bit more globally than we would a single SMR unit. So we are right now looking at the CNSC regulations, the Impact Assessment Agency's regulations, kind of meshing all that together, looking at all the activities that we would need to do so we can not be sitting on the sidelines throwing rocks, but actually working collaboratively with the CNSC and Impact Assessment Agency to find opportunities to be more efficient and help us get there. So, and in parallel to doing the impact assessment, we will do as much planning and design work on the eventual site for a 35 deployment as we can. So it's not all serial either. There's lots we can do in parallel to the impact assessment process.
Excellent. Well, thanks everyone for that one. Maybe I'll turn over to another question we get asked quite frequently is about spent fuel or nuclear waste. And maybe, Paul, maybe I'll start with you. And I think, I'd like to get your perception of the nuclear waste that gets produced, and maybe you can start by just explaining, what comes out of the reactor, the spent fuel or the waste that comes out of it. We've heard people talk about, is it come out in liquid form? Does it come in solid form? What are the levels of nuclear waste and stuff like that? And maybe you can start by, telling us a little bit about that.
Sure, and without a doubt, waste is always a topic that the public wants to learn more about, and so that's great. So the what comes out is used fuel, and I'd like to say that rather than spent fuel because there's still potential energy in it. But the used fuel comes out, and physically it is looking like the same form and shape that it was when it went into the reactor. So, for example, in the CANDU reactors, the fuel is like it is in a bundle. It is with a number of elements. It's roughly the size of a piece of firewood, and so when it comes back out of the reactor, albeit its physical properties have changed considerably, its physical appearance looks the same as when it went in. Nuclear power plants produce a lot of energy from very little fuel compared with, say, fossil fuels or any other form of energy, and thus they produce relatively small volumes of waste. And if we look at based on the data that was produced at the end of 2022, Canada's existing inventory of used fuel is about 3.2 million fuel bundles. And that sounds like a big number, but consider that's from the entire nuclear operation for roughly 50 years. And the amount of economic spin-off that it did, positive environmental effects that it has, the avoidance of greenhouse gas, it's just amazing. And if you stack that like cordwood, it would fit in 9 NHL hockey rinks from the ice surface up to the boards. And that's really quite amazing when you think about it. Only 9 for all of that power over that period of time. Now, before it will go to the Deep Geological Repository, the used fuel is safely stored at the reactor sites.
Oh, sorry, noise. Well, thanks for that. One question, I guess, Billy, that you'd made mention to, instead of calling it spent fuel, used fuel, is there a use for this fuel after it comes out of a reactor?
There potentially is. Right now, with the CANDU fuel cycle, we are using a once-through fuel cycle. So when the fuel comes out, it is cooled initially in a fuel bay because it does produce a lot of heat, And so it is stored initially in a pool of water, specially designed bay, for a period of 7 to 10 years as it cools down. And that water also provides for a necessary shielding from radiation. After that period, it is in most plants around the world, it is then removed from the water pool and put into some kind of a dry storage facility, which are located on the sites. Now, there is potential. There is a lot of still potential energy that could be used in that fuel. But right now, as I say, it's a once through fuel cycle, and the plan is to, once the Deep Geological Repository, assuming that will go through its siting process and be accepted by a informed and willing host, and then we'll go into the licensing process for the Deep Geological Repository. And once that is actually built, then it would be transported to that Deep Geological Repository and then stored in that contained facility.
Okay, excellent. You mentioned the Deep Geological Depository. Can you maybe explain what that is for folks listening?
Sure. So I should step back a little bit and say that the Nuclear Waste Management Organization, or we refer to it as NWMO, was established under Canada's Nuclear Fuel Waste Act to investigate managing Canada's used nuclear fuel and to implement the plan. And the plan that was developed and approved by government after considerable public interaction is a adaptive phase management program, which utilizes a centralized containment and isolation of Canada's used nuclear fuel in a deep geological repository in an area with suitable rock and geology, and involves an informed and willing host, as I mentioned. And this is consistent with international best practice. The plan also involves the development of a transportation plan to move the used fuel from the facility where it's currently stored to the DGR. Site selection for this Deep Geological Repository began about in 2010. And there were about 22 communities and First Nations expressing potential interest. And so over a period of time, those were reviewed, and we're now down to 2 potential sites where more detailed studies are currently underway. So working with these communities, NWMO will continue to work through the steps in the site assessment process with a view of identifying a preferred site for the Deep Geological Repository by the fall of 2024. And assuming community acceptance, NWMO will then initiate the licensing process, and if successful, plans for the start of construction to begin in around 2033, an operation to begin early in the 2040s. Gary mentioned, that deep in the nuclear philosophy is defense in depth. And so that's part of what this whole concept around a deep geological repository is, with a number of very important layers of defense to ensure that we can safely contain this material over the time frame in which we need to have it managed. I think the other thing that's important to talk about with used nuclear fuel is the regulatory process in Canada requires, as part of the license, a preliminary decommissioning plan that includes the long-term disposal of used fuel. And these plans have to be costed, and then financial guarantees have to be put in place prior to the operating license being issued by the CNSC. And that is monitored throughout the lifetime of the plant. So those necessary funds to ensure that the waste can be responsibly managed over the time period in which it needs to be is already accounted for in the cost of electricity. And that is really quite significant. So not a lot of waste, A lot of research and development has gone into how to safely manage it, and necessary costs have been put aside to ensure that it will be taken care of for future generations.
Excellent. Well, thank you. Maybe a question over to you, Gary, just as we're talking about spent fuel and you, I guess not spent fuel, used fuel. You know, it does the amount of used fuel that comes out of some of the new SMRs that are being proposed, is it different than the fuel that comes out of, say, a CANDU reactor?
Simple answer is yes, Doug. Some are less, some are more, depending on the technology we're speaking of. They're all, relatively speaking, very small. But the BWRX, for example, is less fuel than would be from a traditional CANDU. But there are other SMR technologies that are more or less than that.
Okay, excellent. Just moving on to another question we've got here. Maybe since we've got you up here, Gary, I'll ask you this question. It's related to water and cooling. Can you explain, you know, I think Chief Emily mentioned, you know, water temperatures and things like that from the reactors. Can you explain a little bit about how water is used in terms of cooling reactors and things like that, and how much water is actually required for some of these things?
You know, I'm not a technical guy, right? You know this, right?
Yeah.
Paul will have to help me here. We bring lake water into the reactor. So in essence, you have a closed loop system where you have heavy water flowing through the nuclear fuel bundles in the reactor core, picking up heat, right? Those create steam to the steam generator, right? And then is condensed. So there's a closed loop in the steam generator side, which is light water that is condensed using lake water. So you run lake water in to cool the steam in order to condense the water to basically cycle it back through. And that's maybe the simple non-technical answer. There's probably much more technical specificity to that, but that is the heavy water in the core of a CANDU, light water used to cool and condense steam to water.
Oh, excellent. Yeah, that was one of the questions we got from the audience. They were just curious when Chief Emily mentioned the warmer water, where that warmer water came from. You know, Paul, anything you want to add to that? Or?
It just what happens, it warms up. It's cooling. It's cooling hot, warm water. So we'll pick up a little bit of heat from that, and the temperature delta is very small from the intake to the output, so to speak.
Yeah. And Curve Lake monitored that. And we were satisfied with that answer.
There you go. Well, thanks for those questions. You know, I think we're getting to about 15-20 minutes to the end of the panel here. So maybe I'll turn one question over to all the panelists, and then maybe we'll go through. I've got a list of questions here, and we'll start going through some of the questions. You know, I guess I'd like to get each of the panelists' perspective on some of the critiques we hear about SMRs. You know, first, that they are unproven, so why take the risk? And then with regards to the cost, what value do SMRs bring to the grid? And maybe, Chief Emily, since you're up there first on my screen right now, maybe I'll ask you the question, you know, since they are proven, you know, why do you think Canada should take the risk looking at things like nuclear power here in Canada?
So I mean, I think what I learned about this question, Doug, is that the BWXR that GEH that's going to be deployed in Ontario and Saskatchewan, it's shrunk down technology. It's not new technology. So it's working other places. They've just figured out how to make it more efficient, just like we did with computers, right? Like, think about the old desktops from back when I was a kid. And now I've got this tiny little laptop I can take around. It's the same idea. We've made the footprint smaller. So to me, that brought a lot of comfort. We're not reinventing the wheel. We're taking a proven technology and refining it and making it more efficient and better. So that really helped with my sort of concerns about this new, quote, new technology, right? What was the second half of the question, Doug?
You know, I think that answered it. I guess, you know, as we're looking at nuclear power, you know, why is this important for us to look at? And you know, what value do you see them bringing to Canada potentially as we start to look at building nuclear power here in Canada?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the value they bring is a massive reduction in carbon emissions, and We talk about cost and this cost and that cost, but what we don't usually talk about is the environmental cost to not doing it. And I think to me that was what tipped the scales from being reluctantly accepting of nuclear to being very supportive of nuclear. I know my community continues to suffer the impacts of hydroelectric development in Ontario, with land claims that are ongoing. So hydroelectric and the massive footprint that comes with that is not something that we love. When I look at the energy consequences of other forms of energy, I see a big need to use all of them together. I really like the lifestyle that I have. I'd like to continue to have that lifestyle, knowing that I'm not doing significant environmental damage. And I appreciate the opportunity to reuse spent fuel, used fuel from CANDU reactors with technology like Moltex that's being developed. So I feel like there's a lot of opportunity to build on the nuclear conversation, to build nuclear and make this a really impactful in reducing climate change.
Excellent, Shiva. Maybe Paul, I'll go to you, and then maybe over to George. Paul, why do you think the work ongoing in Canada to look at things like nuclear power is really important?
So that's a great question, and I wanted to say that Emily, I think, nailed the response to that question very nicely. But in addition, if we look at what benefits there are to Canada of being an early leader in this, recognizing we're very careful, it's an upscaling, there's been a lot of work that has been done, but there's potential that significant export opportunity is there. And not only does that bring dollars into Canada, which is really important for the economy, but also it is our role in helping the rest of the world decarbonize. Because while it's important for Canada to decarbonize, in reality, Canadians' contribution of GHG from Canada is relatively small compared to other countries in the world. So if we can help export technologies that allows it to be affordable and other countries to reduce their greenhouse gas, that's a significant contribution to the environment above and beyond, what we're doing here in Canada. And we're spurring on economic development as well. And I in that same vein, there is a very close link between energy poverty and economic poverty. And so if you look in really around the world and how important it is, and that countries as they develop will want and deserve to raise their standards of living, the potential of SMRs to do that is very important. And so from, that's very consistent with Canadian values of trying to, bring peace to the world, raise everybody up globally. And so all of these are the potentials to be there if we are early movers. And we've seen, the potential, benefits already. You look at what OPG is doing. They've got working with Tennessee Valley Authority in the US with a similar reactor design. Now there's discussions of it, in Poland as an example. And not only to all of those benefits, but also the potential energy security that will come with it as well. So those are a lot of additional, very important spin-offs that really result from the leadership, the vision, and the cooperation that's going on here within Canada.
Well, thanks for that, Paul. George, maybe I'll ask you the same question. Why is this work? And maybe I'll go to Sarah and then over to Gary. But George, why is all of the work going into looking at nuclear power here in Canada? Why is that important in your view?
Honestly, between what Emily said and Paul said, he touches on really good benefits, and I don't know if I could say it any better than those two folks. But having said that, I do think that the thing about the nuclear energy sector is that once you invest in it, you are not only achieving your climate goals and attaining those clean energy sources that Emily spoke to in terms of sustaining our lifestyle, enabling our quality of life, both domestically but also internationally, as Paul pointed out, but also creates jobs. It creates innovation. It creates science. It creates in terms of some of the technologies, medical isotopes for the larger reactors and such. So there's real ecosystem that gets created that creates job opportunities and innovation opportunities that have benefits well beyond the sector itself.
Oh, excellent. Well, I don't, Sarah or Gary, anything you want to add to that? I think we've had some really good answers, but any way thing you want to add to some of those questions? Gary, I think you got your hand up there.
Yeah, I mean, Doug, to your original question, which is really why BWRX? Why are we running SMRs? So, Ontario went through a rigorous process. We spent 2.5 years looking at the whole spectrum of SMRs available. And we selected BWRX for a couple of reasons. One, X is 10th generation. So this is not, as Paul said, we are not deploying a reactor technology that has never been licensed. We're deploying a version of a reactor technology that has been licensed, a version of the reactor technology that is smaller and simpler than the dozens of these reactors that are already operational throughout the world. This reactor uses the same fuel source as reactors qualified throughout the world. So we're not going in this, taking any risk. We went in this and did a full analysis to de-risk an SMR deployment this decade. There are other technologies that we think will come online early the next decade and beyond, which will help decarbonize industry. But this one was all about a technology solution this decade that could provide electricity over the traditional grid that nuclear is used for. One that we felt confident that it was licensable, would meet all our design requirements, and could be deployed this decade. So by the time Saskatchewan deploys this reactor, it'll already be deployed in Ontario and fully commissioned. So you will have the benefit of the lessons learned from OPG. The nuclear industry, unlike most industries, we share extensively. That's why we have the partnership with Tennessee Valley Authority, because they're currently operating large boiling water reactors. We will learn from them, and they want to deploy up to 20 of these SMRs. That's the same reason why we've partnered with Synthos Green Energy in Poland, so that they want to deploy 79 of these in the 30s and early 40s. So we are sharing in the design costs so that we can have a standard design, and a larger order book starts to create the opportunity to modularize, develop parts of these plants in factories to lower the cost, and we'll all benefit from that in the end. So it is an exciting opportunity. In Ontario, we still will need large gigawatt reactors. We truly believe that. We have the energy demands for it. But in smaller jurisdictions that are currently operating 300 to 600 megawatt coal plants at a site, there's a great opportunity to remove coal plant, insert SMR, connect to the existing grid, and provide clean baseload energy. So that's exactly what jurisdictions like Poland are doing. And the opportunity to be involved in something like this that can create the demands that are needed to help deal with climate change and energy security needs across the world is actually quite exciting. It's what gets me up excited every day. So I think it's a huge, huge opportunity for us in Canada to start, to be the leader, creates opportunities at home, but an export market to help other countries get there as well.
Yeah, I think one thing you mentioned there in passing, you mentioned that you're not only looking at SMRs for deployment in Ontario. I think earlier we spoke about just the big challenge that Ontario is looking at in terms of the amount of energy you're going to require when you start to move to full electrification of your economy. And I think that's going to be something going on in other places. So you're looking at other types of nuclear technologies as well for deployment in Ontario.
Yeah, correct. We have a project to deploy a micromodular reactor at Chalk River by 2027. The goal of that 5 megawatts, a very small micro reactor, is to replace diesel engines in remote communities and mines, to provide electricity, but also steam for water desalination, heating, residential heating, agricultural use for food security. There's so many benefits of that micromodular reactor opportunity. And then both New Brunswick and OPG are working with partner companies to look at how do we decarbonize industry. A lot of heavy industry has combined cycle gas turbines running to create steam for industrial processes. The question is, can we use nuclear to do that, to help decarbonize industry and provide using steam from a nuclear plant to replace those processes? The answer is yes, and we are working with companies to be able to do that in probably early to mid 30s.
Okay. I don't know, Sarah, anything you want to add to that? We got a bunch of questions we get to, but certainly if there's something you'd like to add to the discussion about, the importance of nuclear power here in Canada and things like that.
So I think as the regulator, our focus is on the importance of safe SMR deployment. And so that's the work that we've been doing is to ensure that if there is to be SMR deployment across the country, that it's done safely.
Yeah. Oh, excellent. Well, I'm gonna turn over to a couple of questions we've got from the public. And I think the first one, Emily, maybe I'll start with you and then maybe over to George and others. You spoke earlier on about the importance of early engagement and things like that in communication. It got to one of the questions. I'll just read the question here too. Is like, with nuclear energy being such an emotional topic, how do we have more productive conversations in the public about it? It seems to be sometimes it's a very polarizing conversation to have. How do we have those more productive and constructive communications? And is there a strategy for communication and community engagement? And is it different now with social media and internet and stuff like that? I don't know if you've got some thoughts on just maybe how do we be successful as we're having this discussion about energy transition?
I think it's very much that having discussions, sort of at the local community level, talking with people, talking with individuals, of course, different governments, different stakeholders. But, there truly has been, Doug, a real transformation in the way that we communicate. Social media has, of course, provided different types of platforms to engage with people. Sometimes they're positive, sometimes maybe not so positive, but they are definitely different ways of communicating. But one thing we've seen is that there has been a significant increase of the inclusion of nuclear and the acceptance of nuclear. And if I could just go back to your earlier question to me right at the beginning, it is a huge transformation of the language of the federal government. If you look just in the last couple of weeks, you've had the Biden-Trudeau meeting, which came out with a statement that it clearly included nuclear as part of the climate/energy security initiatives of both countries. You had Minister Wilkinson attend the G7 ministerial meeting in Japan with his colleagues from France, United Kingdom, Japan, which is restarting its nuclear fleets because of the very challenges on climate and the like. And I think in the Canadian context, whether you're talking about Ontario, Saskatchewan, New Brunswick, and other jurisdictions, it's very much driven by the notion that there truly is a realization that there is a climate crisis, and therefore you must address it somehow. And all technologies play a role. And so nuclear has significantly been seen as playing an important role. And it's happening very organically. And you're seeing groups that maybe historically have been not so supportive of nuclear. But to Emily's point earlier, there's a realization that there needs to be a multi-technology approach to addressing and maybe helping sustain our livelihoods and creating new opportunities while mitigating the challenges around climate. And these technologies, and they're plural, quite frankly, are going to provide solutions for on-grid applications, but also the resource development sector that's very dear to Saskatchewan, for example, that have to be put on the table now. So there's a real positive trending in terms of communication. And that doesn't mean that we don't continue and we don't talk openly and transparently, and we try to address people's questions, legitimate questions, but there really is a significant shift that's occurring, and it's really being driven by people realizing that solutions have to be found to some of these problems.
Yeah, excellent. Well, thanks a lot for that, George. Emily, maybe I'd ask your question, like, how do we have productive conversations about some of these things that, things like nuclear power and energy transitions? When some of the times the conversations can be quite polarizing. How do we do that effectively? And maybe there's things you can share with us to help us have better conversations or good conversations here in Saskatchewan.
Absolutely. I just want to check first. One of my headphones has died. Can you still hear me okay?
Still hear you great.
Okay, perfect. I think a lot of what helped in the conversations that we were having was building trust. And that can be a really difficult thing to build from a First Nations perspective. And a lot of that was openness to hearing our concerns. I know We sat down with an open mind, very skeptical about nuclear, but we were willing to have the conversation. And OPG sat down with an open mind to hear what our concerns were and took them to heart and gave us access to the information that we wanted, invited us to participate, made sure that there was room for that. And so I think the relationship that we built with OPG in the last 3 or 4 years now has really been about trust. We asked for evidence that these things were to our liking, to our standard, didn't raise any concern. And OPG took us out and conducted the information and shared reports and scientific data with us. It certainly helped that the environmental biologist that we work with is a community member, so he knows what our community's concerns are. He's deeply ingrained in our traditions, and so that really, really helped build that trust. We knew he knew what they were talking about, and we knew he knew what we were talking about. So finding that communication piece in the middle was really helpful. And then at any point where we've had a concern about an environmental impact as the Darlington New Nuclear Project goes forward, we've sort of sat down with OPG and gone over that concern, and they've found ways to accommodate it. And it's that willingness to hear, that open-mindedness on both sides. My journey through nuclear, if you've heard me speak before, was from a perspective of not in my backyard, not in my traditional territory. And the more that I learned about it, the more I thought we needed to do it. We need more nuclear, and I've been trying to watch the Q&A as much as I can, but it's coming fast. And lots of questions about why not more CANDUs. And Gary, I think you said this already. In Ontario, we think we're going to need both. And I love the energy sovereignty that we get with the CANDU reactors. And I like the deployability and the scalability of the SMRs. And I love the opportunity for First Nations who are stuck in these diesel generating issues and the climate impacts that they see, having an opportunity with micromodular reactors. I like wind and solar. I think that we need them as well. And I think there's a lot of opportunity from a cultural perspective, certainly with the Ojibwe people, to look and see that our teachings are about balance. It's about not overusing any one thing. So I think we need balance in nuclear and renewables and all of those things. So I think building that relationship, Doug, is what's really important. Come in with open ears. How can you argue against something if you don't take the time to understand it? How can you argue against someone who opposes it if you don't take the time to understand their opposition? So it's really back to the basics of human respect, listen, and then be open-minded about responses.
Excellent. That was a great. I think that's a great way to. I think we're close to it. I think that's a great way to kind of end the conversation here. And I'll say, we've still got a lot of questions that are coming up from the panelists. So I'll say, we will endeavor to respond to everybody who's put a question in the chat box here and provide you with a response to that. I want to begin, as we're wrapping this up, I just want to thank our panelists. I think for many of you, this is probably your first time hearing from some of these panelists. I've heard them speak or been on panels with them, and I'll say, this is as good a group of panelists as you can get when you're talking about a topic like this. So I just like to take that time to thank all of our panelists for sharing, for your willingness to share your perspective and your lived experiences with us as it relates to this topic. So thank you for that. I also want to give a huge thank you to everyone who came in. I haven't seen the total numbers here. I know at one point we were close to 400 people trying to register for this or being in. So I think that speaks to the interest in this. I haven't seen the total number that came in at the end, but I just want to thank everybody for taking the time for this conversation. This is our first Power Talk, and based on the numbers we've seen, I think we're going to have lots more of these. And as I said, we will be having more of these. I hope you'll join us for our next Power Talk events. Next Tuesday, we'll be speaking about nuclear power. We'll be speaking about with our planning project team and speaking about the process that's involved in siting and what we're doing in terms of siting potential nuclear power plants here in Saskatchewan and how that's progressing. We're going to have 2 sessions next Tuesday, and one of them's at noon and one of them's going to be at 6:30 at night. Next Wednesday, we're having a panel similar to this one, but this will focus on, and we'll bring in some experts, some equally great experts to come in and talk about that. But this one will be focused around, utility scale renewables. We'll learn and share information about the benefits of renewables, perspectives from Indigenous opportunities with regards to new renewables, and how to bring it all together from a planning perspective. Finally, on May 10th, we're bringing our electricity industry experts and professional panels to share their knowledge and experience on a number of topics like wind and solar power, hydropower, compressed air storage, nuclear power, carbon capture and storage on natural gas. We'll also talk about efficiency programs, microgrids, and interconnections. You can get details for all of these upcoming power talks at our website at saskpower.com/power talks. I almost added the www in there, but my kids say that makes me seem like an old man for saying that, but it's just saskpower.com/power talks. In terms of our future supply planning work, we're nearing the end of stage 2 of what I said was a 5-stage process. So far we've had over 15,000 residents provide input, and I want to thank each of those residents for sending in your thoughts on this. This is an excellent participation by industry standards. I've certainly exceeded my hopes for it. We continue to hear priorities like affordability, the environment, social consideration like jobs, and the economy are all really important. Please feel free to go to saskpower.com/engage to ask a question, share your ideas, and sign up for our newsletter to stay informed of these discussions as they're ongoing. And I think right with that, I'm almost exactly right on time. So again, I want to thank our panelists. I want to thank everybody for taking the time to dial in today. And I hope you have a great rest of the day. And for those of you who we didn't get to ask your question, we will endeavor to get an answer back to everybody who posted a question here for us. So thank you, and have a great rest of your